Hello and welcome to Contemplations. I'm Josh and I am joined by Harry.
Hello there.
And what we are going to be talking about today is how can bad people become popular and liked? How can people who have traits which, could be argued were negative hold positions within society which are revered or well respected and things of that nature? And we're going to be talking about this more in terms of personality and traits and things like what makes someone good and bad, because of course these two things are what the argument will be predicated on later on. But we'll also be talking on when bad people kind of become criminal, and we're going to be talking at some of the more extreme end towards the end of the discussion as well. So first and foremost, I'd like to say that this was your idea, and this was something
Yes, it
that
was.
I know a fair amount about and have thought a great deal about, so I felt like I could.
It is something that I've been interested in for a while, just because even in just day-to-day life, you can see examples of it. There are plenty of people who are not what you would refer to as traditionally likable, or certainly not, at least to me, to be seen as traditionally likable in their personality or their attitudes or just the way they hold themselves, and they still seem to gather a crowd around themselves and are able to ingratiate themselves into others' company much more easily than you'd expect of certain people. And as you've said, this goes all the way from like low level elements where somebody's just a bit unpleasant but can still have a certain charisma to them, you could say, all the way up to the point where, as we'll find out later on in this discussion, people can do unspeakable things and still be able to attract admiration from some people. And the thing is, most of those people that are attracting otherwise, or other than that one element, would be considered relatively normal, you could say. I've known people in previous jobs who have actively been, well, here's the thing, they always tend to be women doing these things, I've found, because I used to, one of my previous jobs, I used to work with a woman who would actively send in letters to prisoners who were convicted of violent crimes. And that was one of my...
Nuts.
Obviously, there's lots of documentaries about criminals and other such people, and they always seem to have an element of, and they have a fan club on the outside of some form. But that was my first like face-to-face experience meeting somebody who was into that. And I used to ask her, like, why? And it all came down to variations on the idea of, it's a bit exciting. So yeah, that's why it's interested me, just because it's like I've sort of like furrowed my brow at those sorts of people and gone, why? What attracts you to these weirdos?
It's one of those things where, in terms of criminality, which isn't actually what we're going to be talking about straight away, but
Yes.
later on, it seems like, particularly in terms of like watching documentaries and films and things like that, women are very much overrepresented looking at violent criminals. And on the one hand, you can kind of understand, because you want to be prepared, because potentially, you're dealing with people who are going to be stronger than you, biologically speaking. So you want to know what you're looking out for. But also, it seems to be a bit more than that. And there's certainly some kind of psychology of attraction there going on a little bit in some people, which we will talk about. But the first question that I would like to answer is, why are people who either lack virtue or are morally bad, which of course are subjective terms that we're going to have to define, often well-liked or popular? And this isn't on the criminal level, this is just people in general, just looking at the human condition, human nature, human behaviour, and we're going to try and come to some conclusions here. So the most obvious answer, which I think does account for a reasonable portion, is that sometimes people who you could point to as being morally bad are liked by people who have the same deficiencies in the same areas. Because, of course, if you have something that is perhaps an antisocial value, then someone else having that value almost makes you more drawn to them than if it were just a positive pro-social thing, because it's harder to come across.
Yeah, so somebody who is particularly abrasive in conversations, say they're very vulgar and like to just insult people at the drop of a hat, might attract other people who are of that similar mindset, just because perhaps they find that they push people who aren't like that away from themselves, you could say.
But then it could also potentially go the other way, in that people who perhaps are quite abrasive want people who are pushovers, who aren't going to
Yeah.
call them out on it and just go along with it rather than otherwise. So it's one of those things where it's a very complicated thing, of course, human behaviour. There's no neat and tidy explanation for anything. There's always caveats to throw in and lots of different factors to consider. But that is one of them. So research seems to suggest that the less we actually know about someone, the more your actual similarity to them affects how much you like them. So
Okay. Would this be in a sense, because I obviously I'm not as knowledgeable on psychology as you are, but I'm aware of the aspect of human behavior where we kind of mirror one another sometimes. I've heard of mirroring. Is that an actual thing?
um, um, it depends how you mean it, I suppose. In what way?
In like body language and other such
Okay,
and
yeah,
other
yeah.
such things like that. So could it be an aspect of
I think mirroring quite often is when you've already established that you like someone, and you're more likely
okay.
to mirror their behaviour by in your body language, and it's not even a conscious thing. It's just something that people do automatically, and it's a good cue actually to kind of pick out if you want to tell if someone likes you, if they're sat similarly to you. I feel rude now. I need to.
Oh no, Josh, what are you saying?
Well, it's obviously not true all the time, and this
Yeah.
is an important caveat to add because, of course, with these sorts of things, they're not always true of everyone, and
Yeah, they're not hard and fast rules
yeah,
that you
they're
could say.
useful generalizations though, in that you can kind of have an understanding that can apply more generally, but you need to look at things in a case by case basis. But it's still a good and useful guideline in these sorts of things.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is more potentially just recognizing, this aspect of your personality is similar to mine, therefore it gives you an initial hook to be able to
Yeah.
relate to one another on.
I also find it interesting that when you don't actually know someone, your actual similarity, not even your perceived similarity, is most important, which is quite interesting. That
How
I
would
suppose
you
it's
differentiate your actual difference versus perceived different
well, there are lots of
similarity?
different ways you could measure it. You could do the Big Five personality test or something like that, or it could just be interest in certain things. So I don't know, someone's interested in playing American football, and so are you, and you could probably pick that up relatively quickly. I mean, they've got a specific build,
Yeah.
you know.
I suppose there are telltale signs in those kinds of cases.
Yeah, so I just thought that was quite interesting that actually being more similar only really works initially, and then supposedly this is thought because there's little else to base your impression on other than this kind of similarity, and perhaps you might have these initial similarities, but once you get to know someone, you realise, okay, they've got this certain trait about them. Maybe, I don't know, they're particularly, I don't know, rude when they're talking. They cut you off, and it's really irritating, and you just can't overlook it. But otherwise, you've got a lot in common.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where
over the long term, perhaps those more negative aspects that aren't as apparent when you first meet one another can become a bigger and bigger issue as you start to recognise it more and more.
that seems perfectly reasonable. But I think it also kind of plays into validating your own worldview as well. In that,
Oh yeah.
if someone is more similar to you, you're more likely to like them initially because it's validating your values, isn't it? In that you're obviously coming to the table, coming to a conversation with a certain amount of what's the words, like a social kind of stake. You're risking a little bit of social capital, I suppose, is a way you could put it. Because
Like, there's always that fear upon first meeting somebody that you could make a fool of yourself.
yeah, exactly. So in having similarities with someone, it reflects well on you in your own mind because it's saying, okay, well, these things I value are also valued by someone else, so maybe they're a bit more objective.
There's an element of risk reduction in the social situation that comes in with that. So
I think that's something that people are quite cognizant of, and it may not always be strictly conscious in their mind, but I think people would at least notice it in a conversation, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And that's definitely something that can play into it. of course, we feel positively towards them because we feel positively towards ourselves is the underlying kind of psychological mechanism. And I imagine that even though people have aspects of themselves that they may not like, broadly speaking, they think that they have the right approach to life because
Yeah.
it seems a bit weird to
Yeah,
exist
so
otherwise,
there's
doesn't
that
it?
element of validation, as you've said. If I can see, well, if somebody else feels the same way that I do, then there must be something to that. There must be some element of truth that I am approaching in my own worldview.
And of course, the final thing I wanted to kind of mention is that if someone's got similarities to you, there's a relative amount of certainty that they'll at least like you a little bit. And
Yeah.
you're not having to put as much at stake in a social sense.
So that's the element of risk reduction
It is,
that you could apply there.
But something that's quite interesting is that in more long-term relationships, some researchers suggested that perhaps actual similarity has no effect and it's just perceived similarity. But this certainly isn't the case for everyone. It's one of those things where it's more of a generalization, but it's interesting that the more you get to know someone, it's more about your perception rather than your actual similarity, which you think it might be the reverse, that it would be more towards being actually similar than just perceiving that you're similar. But I kind of understand why it might come about, because sure, you could perceive someone as being similar and there actually be similarities, but also it includes your misconceptions about having similarities. Not everyone is a perfect judge of their own socializations, are they? So they may have things in their head that they may think they're more similar to someone than they might otherwise be, and this is why they might act more favorably to them than they might have otherwise.
In the long term, surely, if you've known somebody, like you say, in the long term, how would you say that these perceived similarities can manifest themselves? Because I'm struggling to understand exactly what you mean by that. Because obviously, if you've known somebody for a while, you probably know them a bit better than you did when you first met them. So you should be aware of the similarities that you two actually share. So what would you classify as perceived similarities? And would it be in terms of personality, in terms of attitude, rather than in terms of beliefs or interests, perhaps?
I think all of that actually feeds into
Okay.
it. It's like the all-encompassing aspect of another person, isn't it? But I think one thing that I think might kind of elucidate this a little bit is, say you have an interest in something that you know that I wasn't interested in, but you've spoke to me about it, and I've kind of shown an interest, even though I know that that's something I'm not interested in.
Okay.
So you could argue that even though that they actually don't have an interest in this thing, they're willing to
So
kind of hear you out about it.
yeah, it's that reciprocal nature of a relationship that you have somebody with. Like the way that if you're in a relationship with somebody, your significant other might go on and on and on about this certain thing that you're not really interested in at all. But because it's this significant other and you have a certain vested interest in them as an individual, then you're more inclined to take an interest, or at least feign interest in some
Sure.
cases, you could say.
But that could be a case where it's perceived similarity rather than actual similarity. But there's also, of course, the fact that what you perceive is also partially based on your actual similarity as well. And
Yeah.
I think perceived similarity casts a wider net in the possible things that you could perceive, if that makes sense. Like actual similarity could kind of fall under the umbrella term of perceived
Okay.
similarity in a way. That's the way I see it anyway. I'm not sure whether the researchers would, but that's at least from a semantic and kind of my own experiences. I think that seems to ring true. I don't know how much of that is a scientific statement, but that's at least my understanding.
Sounds all right to me.
So one thing that I think I've hypothesized as being one of the main aspects of why bad people may be well liked and well received is that traits which ensure someone's well liked in the short term and long term can be regarded as being different. And that's something that's very important, I think, because when you're meeting someone for the first time, to get someone to like you, what you need to be like might be very different to what is helpful in the long term. So, for example, if you're loud, you like being the center of attention, and you're confident in following your own kind of principles, your own set of rules, you may well be well liked initially because it gives the impression of being high status. These are traits in which they exude, self-confidence,
Yeah.
your ability to carry yourself, and therefore, if you think you're what you have to say is valuable and important, you're confident in what you're saying, people assume that's because other people have validated you, and your approach to life has at least gone through some degree of challenge.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.